Hello, welcome to the third and last part of this series on the first chapter, theory and methods of perspectives. And here we are going to talk about. We are going to move from the scientific method, which was the basis of positivism, and from positivism, then we transition towards anti-positivism, which is also called interpretivism, and that will be then the end of this first chapter, and the second chapter we will start from the next video. So quickly, as we said, positivism has as its basis science, right? So the scientific method, what exactly is the scientific method? What exactly is science? Science produces knowledge using methods, and it produces knowledge that is factual rather than subjective. It will be factual and objective and not subjective. And what do we mean by that? Objective and not subjective. It means that it will not be based, the knowledge that we produce in science is not based on opinions, it is not based on guesswork, and it is not based on your closely held beliefs. You can't say this is right because I have faith in this. No. In science, if I'm producing knowledge, then that knowledge has to be based entirely on evidence, and it will be based entirely on objective and factual information. And so when we are talking about scientific knowledge, then the theorist that we are going to talk about here is Popper, 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 and he presented his theories in 1934. So that's the reference that you will give. He says that in science we are concerned with identifying problems, which are then studied by collecting information and offering explanation about it. Okay, so that forms the basis of what is called the hypothetico-deductive approach. Initially, we form a hypothesis, a possible explanation for something, and then we test. It is important to then start testing this hypothesis. So your hypothesis then is also your research question. You want to do research on the basis of a certain hypothesis, and this hypothesis, for example, the earth is flat, not round. This may have been a hypothesis in the 1400s, and then this had to be tested using the scientific method, and for that there are certain accepted procedures in science. All right, so these conclusions based on this this hypothesis, the second step is you collect data. Once you collect data, then you draw your conclusions, and these conclusions are not beyond question. Even they can be tested later on to be disproved. So in science, the quest for knowledge on an objective basis will continue on an ongoing basis. Okay, when you are talking about science, please keep in mind the scientific method, as we have already discussed this, the scientific method uses, it has to be reliable and it has to be valid. So reliability and validity are two very important aspects of the scientific method, and we have already discussed this in the previous video, that in reliability, the result must be repeated. If something is reliable, it means, if your method is reliable, it means that it will give the same result or almost the same result if the conditions do not change when you repeat the experiment. Validity means that your method must measure or must study what it claims to study. So if you want to if you want to understand that, you can refer to the previous video. Now please keep in mind there are certain rules or what are called the scientific ethics, which you need to take into account. There are certain rules governing science, and these rules are: number one, scientific knowledge is universal. What do you mean by universal? They need to be evaluated. The scientific knowledge that is produced needs to be evaluated using certain agreed methods. These methods are universally agreed in the world of science. Second, they have to be communal. The scientific knowledge is communal. What do you mean? That it means that the scientific knowledge is available, openly available to the scientific community. All right. So this is like public knowledge in the scientific realm. If the knowledge is scientific, then I can't hold on to it. I have to disseminate that in the scientific community. It's freely shared in the scientific community. All right. 3, the knowledge that is produced, or the scientist who produces the knowledge, has to be disinterested. What do you mean by disinterested? Disinterested does not mean that you are not interested in something. Disinterested means that you have to be objective, okay, and you don't have to have an emotional attachment to the conclusions that you might derive. Okay, for example, I believe that if a certain economic policy is implemented, then inflation will take place. Now that is my belief, and that conclusion is part of my belief system. So I'm attached to that. That kind of attachment, emotional attachment to conclusions, is not something that is called for in the scientific method. In the scientific method, the main responsibility of the scientist is the pursuit of knowledge, not the pursuit of his conclusions. All right. And yes, the scientists can be recognized for their effort, but that should not be the end goal. Okay. Also, a lot of knowledge is produced, or a lot of conclusions are drawn based on financial reward. Okay. I draw a certain conclusion because I'm being financially rewarded for deriving that conclusion. For example, this you may find it hard to believe in our time, but in the 1950s, a lot of researchers drew very good conclusions, or very positive conclusions, about smoking, because the big tobacco companies were paying them to draw such conclusions. All right. That was part of the unethical marketing campaign used by big tobacco companies at the time. So a lot of scientists got paid in heavy paychecks, and they drew certain conclusions which were later on 20 years, 30 years later, were found to be completely erroneous and completely wrong, because they were being financially rewarded. They were not disinterested in the conclusions. They had an interest. They had a financial stake in the conclusions that they were drawing. So that is not ethical in science. So I will draw my conclusions based on objective analysis of the data, not on the basis of either my opinions, my reward, or any ulterior motive that I might have. So that is the third thing about scientific method and scientific research. 4. Okay, so what are the things that we've discussed so far? What are the scientific ethics? Number 1, it has to be universal. The knowledge has to be universal. Second, the knowledge has to be communal. 3, the scientist has to be disinterested. 4, in science there always has to be an element of skepticism. Whatever the conclusions are, whoever may have drawn them, okay, please remember, in science nothing is beyond criticism. Things are only accepted as true because they have so far not been disproven by anybody. The moment another scientist comes up and he presents a more viable theory, then the existing theory may be replaced. All right. So, so in the scientific method, please remember nothing is beyond question. Okay, so now that we have discussed science, let's now talk about positivism. So what is positivism? It is based on the idea that it is both possible and desirable to study the social world in broadly the same way that natural sciences are studied. This is something that we discussed in the last video also, that positivism, at the heart of positivism is the scientific method and the scientific approach. So sociologists must be personally objective, just like science. They should have no preconceived notions, no very rigid, closely held beliefs. Now, you on a personal level, you can have your beliefs, but they must not interfere with your scientific sociological study. That's what the scientific method is saying. That's what positivism is saying. You are, as a human being, of course, we all have our beliefs, and we can have our beliefs, but that should not interfere with the scientific study. In other words, in positivism, the researcher has to be value free. That's the notion of value freedom. Okay, the research process must not be influenced by the researcher's values. Researchers are free to have values, but the research process cannot be influenced by such values. Okay, and then the exact opposite of this approach is interpretivism. Interpretivism is also sometimes called anti-positivism. All right, which means that it basically refutes the scientific method. It basically does not accept the scientific method, because here it is argued that different people in different situations. Now this is a situation, contextual way of looking at social behavior. So different people in different situations understand the social world in different ways. Okay, so when everyone is understanding the social world in a different way, then there is no agreed scientific set of methods of understanding, or even perceiving or studying the social order. So as a result, what are we left with? We are left with an approach where we try to explain and understand reality from the point of view of those people who are experiencing that reality, how those people who are experiencing it are understanding it. Now, just as in the hypothetical deductive approach we were referencing, the thinker was Popper, who had given his theory in 1934. Here the thinker or the sociologist is Harris, and he presents his point of view in 2005, and very nicely he captures the difference between the two methodologies. And he says that positivists use the words like cause, effect, fact, and ultimately they use words like laws, because they are interested in discovering laws. Okay, and these laws that determine human behavior. So they are, what are the words according to Harris that should come to mind when you're talking about the scientific or the positivists? Cause, effect, facts, and laws. But then he says interpretivists argue that people are different from objects because they have consciousness, they have awareness. Awareness of what? People have awareness of themselves, number one. Two, they have awareness of the world around them. They have the ability to think. And then he says that by using the word law, try and understand this law. If I'm acting in a certain way, I'm acting because there is a certain law in social order which is making me behave in a certain way. So Popper says this is explanation of behavior from without. The law is not inside me, the law is outside. There's a sociological law. So that law, that cause is coming from outside. So positivists study and explain behavior from outside, from without, as he says. Whereas the interpretivist is saying that no, people's rules in societies are determined by how they react to the context, how they interpret the context. Okay? So that is more a reaction which is coming from inside. So positivism studies behavior from outside, and interpretivism will study the same behavior from within. And therefore, whereas the positivists will rely on collecting objective data is quantitative data. Quantitative data would mean what's your age, the age group that uses a certain product, for example. Okay, so that's a number, that's a quantity. The income range that uses a certain product, that again is a quantity. So this is more positivist research where quantities are used. In qualitative, why do you use a certain product? Now for that, every individual will have a different answer. We are using the same product. For example, I use a laptop. For what? I use a laptop for, let's say, what's my main purpose of using the laptop? Making documents, making notes, and using platforms like YouTube. Okay, so I'm using the laptop for this purpose. But if you put the same question to a computer programmer, he is going to give you a very different answer. He is using the computer or his laptop to code and to create programs. Okay. Another person who is interested in photography may be using the same computer for creating Photoshop products. Okay, so the buying behavior is similar, but the reasons are different. So why do you use a certain product is a qualitative question, and this qualitative question forms the basis of the interpretivist approach. Okay, so because we need to answer the why question and the qualitative questions, we follow an emergent approach of research. The emergent approach develops as more data comes in. The positivist approach is the approach will not change, because we are just interested in discovering cause and effect, the quantitative data. But when you're doing research on human beings and you're discovering more information, the research design itself will change as more information comes in. The positivist research is goal-based. What do you mean by goal-based? The goal is to test whether a hypothesis is right or wrong. Okay? But interpretivist research is goal-free. We are not testing anything. We are actually trying to find out why people are doing things, for example. Okay? So that is a difference. So I said emergent research. So what do you mean by emergent research? Emergent research is that research which takes shape as more data is collected and analyzed. So now when you are writing the answer, you will say that positivist research is rigid, whereas interpretivist research is not rigid, it's flexible. Okay, so that is about it. That's the end of the first chapter on perspectives. I suggest that you read the notes that are provided with this video, and if you have any questions, you can leave them in the comment section. All right, good luck. See you around.